And let's continue with the third chapter of Mary Poppins Laughing Gas. We have met Mr. Wig, who is Mary Poppins' cousin, and if his birthday falls on a Friday, he laughs so much that he floats up into the air. A tea party has begun on the ceiling of his house with Mary Poppins floating up without laughing. Jane and Michael can't stop laughing. Mr. Wig can't stop laughing. The food is in front of them, and we will continue from there. Mr. Wig smiled contentedly. "It is usual, I think, to begin with bread and butter," he said to Jane and Michael. "But as it's my birthday, we will begin the wrong way, which I always think is the right way, with the cake." And he cut a large slice for everybody. "More tea?" he said to Jane, but before she had time to reply, there was a quick, sharp knock at the door. "Come in!" cried Mr. Wig. The door opened, and there stood Miss Persimmon, with a jug of hot water on a tray. "I thought, Mr. Wig," she began, looking searchingly round the room, "you'd be wanting well, I simply never," she said, as she caught sight of them all seated on the air round the table. "Such goings-on I never did see. In all my born days I never saw such, I'm sure, Mr. Wig. I always knew you were a bit odd, but I've closed my eyes to it, being as how you paid your rent regular, but such behaviour as this, having tea in the air with your guests, Mr. Wig, sir, I'm astonished at you. It's that undignified, and for a gentleman of your age, I never did." "But perhaps you will, Miss Persimmon," said Michael. "Will what?" said Miss Persimmon haughtily. "Catch the laughing gas as we did," said Michael. Miss Persimmon flung back her head scornfully. "I hope, young man," she retorted, "I have more respect for myself than to go bouncing about in the air like a rubber ball at the end of a bat. I'll stay on my own feet, thank you, or my name's not Amy Persimmon. And oh dear, my goodness, oh dear, what is the matter? I can't walk. Oh, help! For Miss Persimmon, quite against her will, was off the ground and stumbling through the air, rolling from side to side like a very thin barrel, balancing the tray in her hand. She was almost weeping with distress as she arrived at the table and put down her jug of hot water. "Thank you," said Mary Poppins. Mary Poppins in a calm voice. In a calm, very polite voice. Then Miss Persimmon turned and went wafting down again, murmuring as she went, "So undignified in me, a well-behaved, steady-going woman. I must see a doctor." When she touched the floor, she ran hurriedly out of the room, wringing her hands and not giving a single glance backwards. "So undignified," they heard her moaning as she shut the door behind her. "Her name can't be Amy Persimmon, because she didn't stay on her own feet," whispered Jane to Michael, but Mr. Wig was looking at Mary Poppins, a curious look, half amused, half accusing. Mary, you shouldn't, bless my soul, you shouldn't, Mary. The poor old body will never get over it, but oh my goodness, didn't she look funny, waddling through the air. My gracious goodness, but didn't she?" And he and Jane and Michael were off again, rolling about the air, clutching their sides and gasping with laughter at the thought of how funny Miss Persimmon had looked. "Oh dear," said Michael, "don't make me laugh any more. I can't stand it. I shall break." Oh, cried Jane as she gasped for breath with her hand over her heart. "Oh, my gracious, glorious, galumphing goodness!" Oh, this is Mr. Wig who said this. "Oh, my gracious, glorious, galumphing goodness!" roared Mr. Wig, dabbing his eyes with the tail of his coat because he couldn't find his handkerchief. "It is time to go home," Mary Poppins' voice sounded above the roars of laughter like a trumpet. And suddenly, with a rush, Jane and Michael and Mr. Wig came down. They landed on the floor with a huge bump altogether. The thought that they would have to go home was the first sad thought of the afternoon, and the moment it was in their minds, the laughing gas went out of them. Jane and Michael sighed as they watched Mary Poppins come slowly down the air, carrying Jane's coat and hat. Mr. Wig sighed too, a great long heavy sigh. "Well, isn't it a pity?" he said soberly. "It's very sad that you've got to go home. I have never enjoyed an afternoon so much, did you?" "Never," said Michael sadly, feeling how dull it was to be down on the earth again with no laughing gas inside him. Never," said Jane, as she stood on tiptoes and kissed Mr. Wig's withered apple cheeks. Never. They sat on either side of Mary Poppins going home on the bus. They were both very quiet, thinking over the lovely afternoon. Presently, Michael said sleepily to Mary Poppins, "How often does your uncle get like that?" "Like what?" said Mary Poppins sharply, as though Michael had deliberately said something to offend her. "Well, all bouncy and boundy and laughing and going up in the air." "Up in the air?" Mary Poppins' voice was high and angry. "What do you mean, pray, up in the air?" Jane tried to explain. "Michael means, is your uncle often full of laughing gas, or does he often go rolling and bobbing about on the ceiling when—" "Rolling and bobbing? The idea! Rolling and bobbing on the ceiling! I'm ashamed of you for suggesting such a thing." Mary Poppins was obviously very offended. "But he did," said Michael. "We saw him." "What, roll and bob? How dare you? I'll have you know that my uncle is a sober, honest, hard-working man, and you'll be kind enough to speak of him respectfully, and don't bite your bus ticket. Roll and bob, indeed, the idea!" Michael and Jane looked across Mary Poppins at each other. They said nothing, for they had learnt that it was better not to argue with Mary Poppins, no matter how odd anything seemed. But the look that passed between them said, "Is it true or isn't it, about Mr. Wigg? Is Mary Poppins right, or are we?" But there was nobody to give them the right answer. The bus roared on, wildly lurching and bounding. Mary Poppins sat between them, offended and silent, and presently, because they were very tired, they crept closer to her and leant up against her sides and fell asleep, still wondering. And that's the end of chapter 3.